The wash at the bottom of Clearwater Gulch was pale and dry, quiet the way a loaded rifle is quiet. Cottonwood roots broke through the banks like old knuckles. Alkali dust settled on everything. The peaks above still held their snow in clean white sheets, and most days the only sound was wind moving through scattered cabin frames that other men had already abandoned. A man with a swollen knee knelt in the gravel, setting broad flat stones into a trench that ran at a strange angle away from his cabin, not across the wash, but pointed into it like a blade aimed upstream at nothing. 8 feet above his head, lodged in a cottonwood fork, a stripped pine log sat where no water had been in years. Roscoe Vale came into Clearwater Gulch in March of 1874, limping behind a mule that moved faster than he did. His right knee had swollen again somewhere past the last creek crossing, and the canvas bedroll across Bishop's Back was the only thing he owned that did not need repair. His shovel was worn thin at the socket. His axe had a crack in the handle wrapped with rawhide. He had $41 in a tobacco tin, 80 pounds of flour, 20 pounds of beans, and a half-rotted cabin frame left behind by a prospector who had walked away 2 years earlier without bothering to pull his nails. His wife had died 4 winters back. His last mining partner had left with the good tools and a better claim near Fairplay. Roscoe had spent 3 years pulling color out of gravel bars that gave back less each season until the math turned honest and told him he was done. The claim in Clearwater Gulch was cheap because everyone called it the gutter claim. It sat at the bottom of a narrow side valley where a dry wash ran within 40 yards of the cabin door. In summer, water holes lingered in the wash after snow melt, and that was the reason anyone built low in the first place. The cottonwoods grew thick along the wash. The ground was flat enough to drag logs without killing yourself. Every practical reason pointed settlers toward the bottomland, and every practical reason was a trap set by a river that only showed up once a decade. Roscoe did not know that yet. He knew only that the claim was what he could afford, and that affording it had cost him nearly everything. He arrived on a Tuesday. By Wednesday, he had cleared the old cabin frame of pack rat nests and counted the usable logs. 7 of the 12 sill timbers were sound. The rest had gone soft where they touched ground. The roof poles were scattered. There was no roof. The fireplace was a pile of river cobbles that had never been mortared, half of them tumbled into the hearth pit. The door opening faced northwest, which meant wind and rain would walk straight in come autumn. He stood in the middle of that ruin and did the arithmetic that mattered. He could roof the cabin or buy winter flour. Not both. The nearest reliable spring was 700 paces uphill, and hauling 2 barrels per day on a bad knee, while the mule could not climb. Loaded after rain meant water access was not a convenience. It was survival. He needed the bottomland. The bottomland was the only thing that might kill him. That was the first impossible number. There were more. The nearest sawmill was in Fairplay, 11 miles east over a wagon road that turned to clay soup every afternoon once thaw set in. Milled lumber cost more than Roscoe had. Unmilled timber meant felling, limbing, dragging, and squaring every piece himself, with 1 dull saw, 1 cracked axe, and a knee that locked if he knelt too long. A proper cabin, chinked, roofed, floored, with a stone fireplace that drew out, would take a healthy man with good tools 6 weeks. Roscoe was not healthy, did not have good tools, and had no one to hold the other end of a crosscut. He started anyway. There was nothing else to start. The first man to tell Roscoe he was a fool did it with a measuring chain and the calm authority of someone who had been right about things longer than Roscoe had been failing at them. Horace Bellamy was 63 years old, county road overseer, former bridge hand on the Kansas Pacific, and the closest thing Clearwater Gulch had to an official voice. He arrived on the fourth day not out of neighborliness, but because new claims near the wash meant new drainage complaints on his road. He rode a dun mare with a county brand and carried the measuring chain looped over the saddle horn like a lariat. Bellamy did not dismount quickly. He sat the mare and studied the cabin frame, the scattered roof poles, the mule tied to a cottonwood with a frayed rope, and Roscoe on his knees fitting a replacement sill log with a mallet that was really a river cobble wrapped in hide. "You are the new man on the Sykes claim," Bellamy said. Roscoe said he was. Bellamy swung down, unlooped the chain, and walked the property without asking permission. He paced from the cabin to the wash, from the wash to the brush line, from the brush line to the slope where exposed rock broke through thin soil. He measured the wash width at 3 points. He kicked a dry cut bank and watched sand pour out of it like flour from a torn sack. Then he came back and stood over Roscoe, who had not stopped working. 40 yards, Bellamy said. That is what you have between your door and the main channel. Roscoe said he knew. Do you know what 40 yards means when a spring flood comes through here at night? Roscoe said he expected it meant trouble. Bellamy crouched. His knees popped like green wood in a fire. He pointed up the gulch with the chain's brass end. I have been road overseer 9 years. I have seen this wash carry ice, mud, logs, and a dead horse. In 68, the water came up 6 feet in 4 hours. In 71, it took a prospector's sluice and deposited it half a mile south in pieces no bigger than your hand. He let the chain drop into the dust. The safe answer is simple. Build on the bench above the wash, or leave. Roscoe looked up the slope. Exposed granite, soil too thin for a garden. 700 paces to the spring, a climb that would ruin his knee inside a month. I cannot build up there, Roscoe said. Then you cannot build here. Bellamy stood and dusted his knees. You cannot argue with water from below it, Vale. A proper flood defense would need cribbing, squared timber, teams, and men. You have none of those things. You have a mule and a bad leg and 40 yards of hope. He rode out without looking back. The measuring chain clinked against the saddle like a slow bell. Roscoe sat in the dirt beside his half-fitted sill log and stared at the wash. It was dry. Pale stones. A few cottonwood leaves from last autumn pressed flat into the sand. Nothing about it looked dangerous. It looked like a path. But Bellamy had not been wrong about 68. Roscoe could see the old cutbank scars. He could see where the channel had chewed 10 feet of clay from the east side and deposited gravel shelves on the west. A river had been here. A river would come back. And when it did, the distance between his door and the center of the wash was 40 yards of flat ground with nothing in the way. He finished the sill log. He did not have a better idea. Not yet. The thing that changed Roscoe's thinking was not a book or a conversation. It was a piece of driftwood caught in a cottonwood fork. He found it the second week, walking the wash to learn where the best water holes collected. The cottonwood stood alone where the gulch narrowed, and 8 feet above the ground, a branch fork held a stripped pine log as thick as his thigh. The bark was gone on one side, polished smooth by water and grit. The other side was rough, still wearing old bark like a scab. 8 feet. That log had ridden 8 feet above the current ground level in a wash that everyone called dry most of the year. Roscoe stood under it and looked at the tree. The upstream side was scarred, bark stripped, smaller branches torn away, a wound in the trunk where something heavy had struck. But behind the tree, the ground was different. Instead of the scoured gravel that lined the rest of the wash, there was a pocket of fine silt, smooth, settled, undisturbed, as if the flood had gone around the tree and left a quiet place in its shadow. He knelt and put his palm on the silt. It was packed firm, layered, the kind of deposit that only forms in still water. The violence had been everywhere else. Here, behind the tree's width, the water had stalled and dropped what it carried. Roscoe stayed on his knees for a long time. The memory came without effort. Alonzo Moya, his dead wife's father, standing in an acequia ditch outside Mora in northern New Mexico, water running over their bare feet. Alonzo had been an acequia hand for 30 years, a man who understood water the way most men understood horses, by habit, by feel, by watching what happened when you changed one thing. Alonzo had taken a flatboard and shoved it into the ditch perpendicular to the current. The water piled against it, climbed, spilled over the top, and pushed the board sideways until Alonzo's boot caught it. Then he pulled the board out and set 2 flat stones in the ditch, their noses pointed upstream like the bow of a canoe. The water struck the point, divided, curled around both stones, and rejoined below them without climbing, without pushing, without force. Alonzo had pressed his thumb against Roscoe's wrist to hold his hand steady in the current and said, "Feel that. A flat thing fights the water. A pointed thing asks the water to choose." Roscoe had been 29 then. He had filed the lesson away the way a man files away his father-in-law's habits, with respect but without urgency. That was 29 years ago. Alonzo was dead. Roscoe's wife was dead. The acequia was 1,000 miles south, but the cottonwood was right here, and the silt pocket behind it was proof that Alonzo had been right about something larger than irrigation. Roscoe stood and looked down the wash toward his cabin. 40 yards. A flat cabin wall facing upstream was a flat board in a ditch. The flood would pile against it, climb, push, and break it loose. But a pointed wall, a stone wall built like a prow, nose upstream, arms opening wide downstream, the water forced to choose a side and accelerate past. Behind the point, a calm pocket, like the silt behind the cottonwood, like the stillness behind Alonzo's stones. Roscoe walked back to the cabin and sat on the half-finished sill. He picked up a stick and drew in the dirt. A V shape, point facing up the gulch, arms extending past the cabin on both sides, the cabin sitting inside the wide end, protected not by height, but by angle. He drew it 3 times. Each time the arms got longer. Each time the point moved farther upstream. The design formed in pieces. The apex would sit 70 paces above the cabin, where the wash narrowed slightly and the flood's energy concentrated. Each arm would run 120 feet downstream at a wide angle, ending past the cabin corners. 6 feet high, 8 feet thick at the base, 4 at the top, battered inward so the weight settled tighter instead of spilling. Heavy through stones every third course to tie both faces together. The upstream nose rounded with the largest granite blocks he could move, so logs would glance off instead of catching. The wall did not need to be watertight. That was the part no one would understand. Roscoe wanted small water to seep through and drain. He wanted the wall to breathe in ordinary rain. What the wall needed to stop was momentum, the first violent surge of a debris flood hitting his cabin broadside. Split the impact, shed the logs and mud to both sides. Let the cabin sit in the calm water behind the wide end, the way silt sat behind the cottonwood. Behind the wall, he would dig a shallow swale to carry seepage away from the foundation. He would raise the cabin floor on stone pads, 18 inches above grade. If water seeped through the wall's joints, it would drain under the cabin instead of pooling in it. The risk was immediate and specific. If he spent spring building stone instead of planning, he would face winter poorer and hungrier. If no flood came, The wall was a monument to paranoia. If the flood came and the wall failed, if the angle was wrong, if one arm collapsed, if debris plugged the nose and turned the V into a funnel, the wall would aim concentrated water directly at his cabin. The thing meant to save him would kill him faster than no wall at all. He sat with the stick in his hand, and the V scratched in the dirt, and felt the weight of what he was considering. Every dollar spent on stonework was a dollar not spent on flour. Every hour spent dragging rock was an hour not spent chinking the cabin or clearing ground for a garden. He was betting his survival on a memory of his dead wife's father standing in a ditch. Elias Ward was the first neighbor to say what everyone would eventually think. Ward was 39, a farmer with 3 children and a claim half a mile downstream. He was not a cruel man. He was a practical one, which in Clearwater Gulch amounted to the same thing when a man was doing something that looked insane. He came by on a morning when Roscoe was marking the line of the left arm with wooden stakes and twine. The wash was dry. The sky was blue. The mountains still held their snow in clean white sheets that caught the sun and looked permanent. "What are you staking?" Ward asked from his horse. Roscoe told him. Ward dismounted and walked the staked line. He stood at the point where the apex would be and looked down both arms toward the cabin. He came back shaking his head slowly, the way a man shakes his head at a dog chasing its tail. "If water comes," Ward said, "it will go over that thing. 6 feet is nothing to a real flood. And if it does not come, you have wasted your planting season on a stone fence that keeps nothing in and nothing out." "It is not a fence," Roscoe said. "What is it then?" "A prow." Ward looked at the stakes again. "A prow." Roscoe picked up his shovel from the pile of tools near the cabin. He walked to the small trickle that seeped from a bank cut where the wash held a last pocket of snow melt. He shoved the flat blade into the trickle perpendicular to the flow. Water piled against the steel, climbed the face, spilled over the top in a muddy curtain. Then he pulled the shovel out and turned it edge first. The blade's narrow edge split the trickle. Water curled around both sides and rejoined below without climbing, without pressure, without force. "A flat wall asks the flood to hit it," Roscoe said. "A pointed wall asks the flood to choose a side." Ward watched the trickle. He was quiet for a moment that was almost long enough to be respect. "A shovel is not a flood," he said. "No," Roscoe said. "That is why I'm building it out of stone." Ward mounted his horse. He looked at the stakes one more time. "You have maybe 6 weeks before the high snow lets go. If you spend those 6 weeks stacking rock instead of planting, and the flood does not come, you will be begging flour before July." He rode off. Roscoe watched him go, and then looked at the trickle still splitting around the shovel's edge. Ward was not wrong about any of it. 6 weeks. No garden. No flour reserve. A wall that might work, might fail, might make things worse. Roscoe pulled the shovel from the mud and started digging the foundation trench for the left arm. The mockery came faster than the wall. By the time Roscoe had the first course of base stones laid along the left arm, broad, flat granite pieces set into the trench with their long axes running into the wall, men at Bellamy's supply shed were already calling it Vale's stone boat. The name was clever enough to stick. A stone boat was a flat sled used for dragging rock, and the joke worked on 2 levels. Roscoe was building something that looked like a boat in a dry river, and he was killing himself hauling stones on an actual stone boat, a rawhide sled he had made from a hide and 2 cottonwood poles because Bellamy had refused to lend the county stone boat for what he called private madness. 1 load at a time. Bishop the mule dragged the sled from the granite outcrop 300 yards up the slope, and Roscoe walked beside, steadying stones that shifted on the hide. Each load was 4 or 5 stones, maybe 300 pounds. Each trip took 40 minutes round. On a good day, he made 12 trips. On a bad day, when his knee locked or Bishop balked at the grade, he made 8. The math was punishing. Each arm of the V needed roughly 60 running feet of wall at 6 feet high and 8 feet thick at the base. The apex needed to be massive, the point where the flood's full force would strike first. He estimated 400 tons of stone total, and he was moving 300 pounds at a time. Gideon Parcher came on the 5th day of construction. Parcher was 46, lean, patient the way a man is patient when he knows hunger does his negotiating for him. He ran credit at his store in the gulch. Flour, nails, salt, powder, and he had a habit of advancing goods to struggling settlers, then buying their claims when they could not pay. 2 families had already lost ground to Parcher that way. He wanted Roscoe's claim because the spring access below the ridge would let him control water rights for several lower cabins. Water rights in a dry valley were worth more than gold to a man who thought in ledgers. Parcher did not ride in with threats. He rode in with an offer, which was worse. He found Roscoe setting base stones in the apex trench, hands raw, dust caked into the cracks of his knuckles. Parcher dismounted and stood at the edge of the trench, looking down at Roscoe the way a man looks at a hole he expects to fill. "Vale," Parcher said, "I will give you $20 and a wagon ride to Fairplay for this claim. Today." Roscoe set a stone, fitted it, checked the seam with his fingers. "No," he said. Parcher pulled a small ledger from his coat pocket and opened it. He did not need to read it. The gesture was the message. A man who spends his seed month stacking rocks should not expect credit when hunger comes. "I have not asked for credit." "Not yet." Parcher closed the ledger. He turned and looked at Elias Ward's cabin downstream. "Remember that when his mule is chewing your fence rails," he said, loud enough for the words to carry. Roscoe did not look up. He set another stone. Parcher mounted and rode toward Ward's place. He would stop there. He would mention Roscoe's wall. He would shake his head and let the silence do the work. Within 3 days, every family in the gulch would know that Roscoe Vale was building a stone prow in a dry wash instead of planting food, and Gideon Parcher would be standing by with flour credit and a quitclaim form. The social cost arrived quietly but completely. Neighbors stopped trading labor with Roscoe. On the frontier, labor trade was how a man without money built anything. You helped raise a neighbor's ridgepole, and he helped split your shingles. Without it, every task took twice as long and hurt twice as much. Children repeated the nickname at the creek where families gathered water. Women who had nodded at Roscoe in passing now looked through him. Tell us in the comments, have you ever built something people dismissed because they could not see the danger you were preparing for? Roscoe kept setting stones. He had seen the driftwood 8 feet high in the cottonwood fork. He had felt the packed silt behind the tree where violence had gone quiet. He had watched water split around a shovel's edge and remembered Alonzo's thumb pressing his wrist steady in a ditch 1,000 miles away. Explaining would not help. He had tried with Ward, and Ward had ridden off unconvinced. He had tried with Bellamy, and Bellamy had measured the wash and pronounced the verdict. Until water came, the wall was only a superstition made of rock, and Roscoe was the fool kneeling in the dirt beside it. But the driftwood did not lie. The scars on the cottonwood did not lie. The old cut banks did not lie. The river had been here before. It would come again, and when it did, the distance between life and death would be measured in angles. Roscoe dragged another sled of granite down the wash. Bishop leaned into the harness. The rawhide creaked. A stone shifted, and Roscoe caught it with both hands before it rolled. His knees screamed. He set the stone back and kept walking. The trench for the right arm was still empty. The apex was only knee-high. 6 weeks of snow sat on the peaks above him, white and patient and heavy with the weight of everything that was coming. The man who saved Roscoe's wall arrived on a burro and did not introduce himself for the first 2 hours. Tomas Velarde was 71 years old, small, dry as a juniper post, with hands that looked like they had been carved from the same stone he had spent his life setting. He came north from the San Luis Valley with 2 burros packed light and a grandson's letter folded inside his shirt that he could not read well because his eyes had started failing and the boy's handwriting had always been poor. He was heading to a daughter's house near Denver, and he had stopped at the wash crossing below Roscoe's claim because one burro needed water and the other needed rest, and Tomas needed both. He sat on a rock near the crossing and watched Roscoe work. Roscoe did not notice him for 20 minutes. When he did, Tomas was already frowning. Roscoe was setting face stones along the left arm's second course, and he was doing it wrong. He was placing the stones with their longest, flattest faces outward, the way a man builds a pretty wall, the way it looks right, the way every instinct says to do it. The broad face showed. The wall looked solid, but the stone's length ran parallel to the face instead of into the wall's depth, which meant each stone was a thin plate standing on edge instead of a deep tooth gripping its neighbors. Tomas watched 3 stones go in before he walked over. He did not speak. He pulled one stone free with both hands, turned it 90 degrees so the long axis ran into the wall instead of along it, and set it back. Then he placed his palm on it and pushed. The stone did not move. He pulled the stone beside it, the one Roscoe had set, and pushed. It rocked. "Do not show the wall its best face," Tomas said. "Give the wall its longest tooth." Roscoe stared at the 2 stones, one stable, one rocking. The difference was orientation, nothing else. "You are a mason," Roscoe said. "I was an acequia man, ditches, headgates, diversion walls. 41 years in the San Luis." Tomas looked down the line of the left arm, then up toward the half-built apex. His frown deepened. "Who taught you to stack stone?" "Nobody." "That is what it looks like." Roscoe could have taken offense. He did not, because the old man was right, and because the old man had not said it with malice. He had said it the way a man says the sky is blue, as fact that does not require apology. Tomas walked the wall. He pressed stones. He kicked base courses. He crouched at the apex and ran his fingers along joints. He stood in the trench where the right arm's foundation waited and looked at the gravel bed Roscoe had exposed. Then he came back and asked the question that mattered. "What is this for?" Roscoe told him. The wash, the flood scars, the driftwood 8 feet up, the cottonwood and the silt pocket behind it, Alonzo Moya and the acequia ditch and the knife blade in the current, the V-shape, the prow, the calm pocket behind the wide end where the cabin would sit. Tomas listened without expression. When Roscoe finished, the old man crouched and picked up a handful of gravel. He let it run through his fingers slowly. "You knew Alonso Moya," Tomas said. "He was my wife's father." Tomas looked up. Something shifted in his face, not warmth exactly, but recognition. The recognition of a man who hears a name from his own world spoken in a place where that world does not exist. "Alonzo understood diversion," Tomas said. "Most acequia men understand delivery, getting water where it needs to go. Alonzo understood refusal, making water go where it must not." He stood and brushed gravel from his knees. "Your idea is not wrong. Your stonework will kill it." He agreed to stay 3 days. He said 3 days because that was what a man says when he does not want to admit he is interested. 3 days became a week. A week became 2. 2 became 3. Tomas never formally agreed to stay longer. He simply did not leave. What Tomas taught, he taught through his hands. The first lesson was stone orientation, and Roscoe had already learned it from the single turned stone. Length into the wall. Always. The long axis perpendicular to the face so that each stone's mass resisted being pushed outward. A wall of thin plates would shatter under pressure. A wall of deep teeth would grip and hold. Roscoe pulled every stone he had already set in the left arm's second course and reset them. It cost him a full day. Tomas watched and said nothing until Roscoe reached the end of the course, and then he said, "Better." The second lesson was batter. Each face of the wall had to lean inward slightly. Not much, just enough that gravity pulled the mass toward center instead of letting it tip outward. Tomas showed this by stacking 4 stones straight up and pushing the top one. It slid off. Then he stacked 4 stones with each one, set a finger's width farther back than the one below. He pushed the top one. The whole stack shifted as a unit but did not fall. "A wall that leans in settles tighter," Tomas said. "A wall that stands straight waits to fall." The third lesson was hearting. Between the 2 stone faces of the wall, the interior had to be packed tight with smaller stones, gravel, and rubble. Not dumped. Packed. Every gap filled. Every void chinked. Roscoe had been tossing rubble into the core the way a man tosses scraps into a bucket. Fast, careless, done. Tomas reached into the core of the left arm and pulled out a loose stone. He shook it. It rattled against its neighbors. "When the flood shakes this wall," Tomas said, "every loose stone inside will dance. Dancing stones make space. Space makes weakness. Weakness makes a hole." He set the stone back, wedged 2 smaller pieces beside it, and tapped them tight with a cobble. Dead stone. No dancing. The fourth lesson came at the apex, where the wall's point faced upstream and would take the first impact. Tomas studied Roscoe's foundation work and shook his head. The base stones were heavy enough, but the ground in front of the point was bare gravel. When floodwater hit the nose, the first thing it would do was dig. The current would scour under the point, undermine the foundation, and the apex would collapse forward into the hole it created. Tomas had Roscoe lay flat stone slabs in a wide apron upstream of the point, overlapping like fish scales, weighted with the heaviest rocks they could move. Between the slabs, they packed bundles of brush, willow and cottonwood branches tied tight and staked down. Tomas called them fascines, and he had used them in every major headgate he had ever built. The brush caught sediment. The sediment armored the ground. The slabs prevented the current from finding bare gravel to chew. "Protect the toe," Tomas said. "A wall does not fall from the top. It falls from underneath." The fifth lesson was debris shedding. The upstream point had to be smooth enough that logs, branches, and ice would strike it and spin away instead of lodging. A rough nose would catch debris the way a comb catches hair, and every caught log would dam the flow and increase the pressure behind it until the wall burst. Roscoe spent 2 days selecting and fitting the nose stones, the largest, roundest granite blocks he could drag from the outcrop. Each one had to sit flush with its neighbors. No ledges, no lips, no places where a log end could catch and hold. Tomas checked the nose by running his palm across it, the way a man checks a horse's flank for sores. Where his hand caught, he pulled the stone and refit it. Where his hand slid, he nodded and moved on. Progress came in stone and pain. By the end of the first week with Tomas, the apex stood waist high, 4 feet of solid granite with a tight core and a smooth upstream nose. The left arm had reached 30 running feet at its base course. Though the upper courses still needed filling, the right arm was behind. Roscoe had only just begun the foundation trench on that side, and the gravel there was mixed with clay that froze overnight and had to be broken with a pick each morning before he could dig. His hands split along every crease. The cracks filled with granite dust and bled when he washed them. His knees swelled and stiffened after each day's hauling until he walked like a man 20 years older than his 58. He ate less than he should have. Flour and beans and creek water. Tomas contributed dried chili and a small bag of piñon nuts that were the best thing Roscoe had tasted in months. Bishop the mule went lame in the second week. A stone bruise on the right forefoot that turned the animal from a hauling partner into a mouth that needed feeding. Roscoe fashioned a poultice from pine pitch and clay and let Bishop rest for 4 days, which meant 4 days of dragging the rawhide sled himself. 300 pounds of stone, 300 yards uphill. His shoulders burned, his spine compressed. He counted loads the way a man counts wounds, not to celebrate, but to know how many more he could survive. A late frost hit in the third week and locked the exposed stones to the ground. Roscoe poured creek water over them to crack the ice bonds, but the water froze too. He spent a morning with a fire and an iron bar, heating the bar in the flames and pressing it against frozen joints until the stones broke free. The process was slow enough to make a man want to weep, and pointless enough to make the weeping feel earned. Parcher refused to sell blasting powder for splitting boulders. He told the clerk at his store that powder sold to Vale was powder wasted, and besides, a man building a wall in a dry wash did not need powder. He needed a wagon to Fairplay and the sense to climb aboard it. Roscoe split boulders with fire and water instead. He built small fires against the granite faces overnight, let the heat soak in, then doused the hot stone with cold creek water at dawn. The thermal shock cracked the rock along its grain. It was slow. It was brutal. It worked. Money bled. $9 went to iron wedges Roscoe had to buy from a freighter passing through, because Parcher's store would not sell to him. $2 went to rawhide for sled repairs when the hide wore through from dragging over gravel. His tobacco tin held $30. Then 22, then 18. Elias Ward's youngest child, a girl of 4, caught a fever in the third week. Roscoe lost a full day of building to help haul water to the Ward cabin because the family's spring access was fouled with runoff mud. He carried buckets on a yoke he fashioned from a branch, uphill and down, his knee grinding with every step. Ward's wife thanked him. Ward himself said nothing, but he met Roscoe's eyes for the first time since the shovel demonstration, and what passed between them was not friendship, but something adjacent to it. The recognition that a man who helps when he has nothing to spare is not a fool, even if he builds like one. Nobody else noticed. The Gulch had decided what Roscoe was, and decisions in small places are the hardest kind to overturn. The unexpected ally came in a bucket. Nate Ward, 12 years old, appeared at the wall one afternoon carrying a wooden bucket full of small stones. He set the bucket down at the base of the right arm, where Roscoe was fitting the first course, and said nothing. Roscoe looked at the stones. They were the right size for hearting, fist-sized, angular, the kind that packed tight into the wall's core. The boy had picked them from the creek bed, where water had broken them into useful shapes. "Your father know you are here?" Roscoe asked. "He is mending fence," Nate said. This was not an answer, and both of them knew it. Tomas noticed the boy before Roscoe knew what to do with him. The old man walked over, picked a stone from the bucket, and set it on top of the wall. He pressed down. The stone rocked. "Try another," Tomas said. Nate picked a flatter stone with a concave bottom. Tomas set it. Pressed. It sat firm. "A good hearting stone does not rock when you push it," Tomas said. "If it dances, the flood will shake it loose. If it sits dead, The flood cannot move it. Test every stone before it goes in the bucket. Nate came back the next day with a bucket of stones that did not rock. And the day after that, Elias Ward pretended not to notice. The pretending was itself a kind of permission. Bellamy returned when the wall was chest high. He rode in on the dun mare at mid-morning, dismounted without the measuring chain this time, and walked the entire length of the structure, left arm, apex, right arm, without speaking. Tomas was fitting through stones at the third course of the right arm. Roscoe was packing harding into the apex's core. Nate was sorting stones by size near the sled. Bellamy stood at the apex and put his hand on the upstream nose. He ran his palm across the fitted granite the way Tomas had taught Roscoe to check for snags. His hand moved smoothly. He looked at the batter, the tight joints, the apron of flat slabs and brush fascines protecting the toe. "The workmanship is better than I expected," Bellamy said. Roscoe waited. There was always a second sentence with Bellamy. "But the design is still wrong. The wall is not straight across the wash. You have left both sides open. Water will go around the ends and come at you from behind." Tomas did not look up from his through-stone. He set his boot in the dust and drew 2 lines around it with a stick. Diverging lines. The shape of the V, the shape of the boot's toe splitting an imaginary current. "Water goes around my boot," Tomas said quietly. "It does not come back from behind." Bellamy stared at the lines in the dust. "A boot is not a flood." Roscoe straightened from the tartan. His back ached. His hands were cracked and bleeding at the knuckles. Granite dust coated his arms to the elbow. "No," Roscoe said. "That is why I am making it out of tons." Bellamy remounted. He did not concede. He did not argue further. He rode out with a face that a generous man might call thoughtful and an honest man would call stubborn. The wall reached 5 feet along most of the arms by the end of the 3rd week with Tomas. The apex hit 6 feet. Through stones crossed every 3rd course, tying the 2 faces into a single mass. The hearting was packed dead. The scour apron was solid. The downstream ends of both arms were still rough. The last 30 feet of each arm needed another course and better capstones. But the structure was recognizable now. Not a pile, not a fence, a prow, a blade made of mountain. A warm wind arrived at night in the 4th week. Roscoe woke to the sound of dripping. The icicles along the cabin's unfinished eaves were bleeding. The temperature had climbed 20 degrees since sundown. He lay on his bedroll and listened to the mountain above him, releasing water through 1,000 cracks and seams, and he felt the countdown begin in his chest like a second heartbeat. Snowmelt was running under the ice in every upper gulch. The wash, dry for months, began to darken with moisture. By morning, a thin sheet of water crept along the lowest channel, only an inch deep, clear, harmless. But Roscoe had seen this before. The small water was a messenger. The big water was sorting itself above. Tomas looked at the peaks that evening and said nothing for a long time. The south-facing slopes had lost their white sheen. Dark rock showed through in patches that grew as the hours passed, snow vanishing into the mountain like a stain fading from cloth. The wind tasted different, wet, metallic, carrying the scent of granite that had been locked under ice all winter and now breathed again. "One more night," Tomas said when Roscoe asked him to stay until the wall was fully capped. "Not because of you, because of that snow." He said it the way a man says a thing he knows is true and wishes were not. The first test came at midnight, and it was small enough to be a gift. Roscoe heard it before he felt it, a low hissing in the wash, like sand pouring through a glass neck. He grabbed the lantern and reached the wall as the first pulse of snowmelt runoff hit the apex. Ankle deep, fast, thick with silt. The water struck the nose and divided cleanly, curling down both arms in twin sheets that caught the lantern light and turned it gold. Roscoe walked behind the wall to the cabin side. The yard was damp, his boots pressed into wet ground, but the water stayed outside the arms, running in two channels that converged again 40 yards below the cabin and continued downhill. Tomas stood beside him in the lantern light, watching the way a man watches a horse he has trained take its first fence. The old man said nothing. He did not need to. The water was speaking for him. Roscoe smiled. It was the first time in months. The muscles in his face had nearly forgotten the shape, but the smile did not last. This was ankle-deep runoff. Gentle, polite. The flood he feared would be 10 feet of mud, ice, logs, and stone moving fast enough to break a cabin into kindling. An ankle was not a test. It was a rehearsal. The warning signs arrived the next day without subtlety. The creek ran brown at noon, sediment from the upper basin washing down in plumes that stained the water the color of old blood. Snow disappeared from south-facing slopes, in sheets, not patches. Whole fields of white collapsed into streams that fed the wash. Cottonwood roots along the bank began to hum with underground seepage, a vibration Roscoe could feel through the soles of his boots when he stood near the trunks. The air smelled of wet granite and pine rot, the smell of a mountain undressing itself of winter in a hurry. Bellamy rode through the gulch and told everyone to move valuables uphill. Most settlers heard him and nodded and did nothing, because the high water they had seen before was ordinary spring runoff, 2 or 3 feet in the wash, noisy but manageable, a thing you stepped around, not a thing that killed you. They did not know what a warm rain on a loaded snowpack could produce. They had not seen the driftwood 8 feet up in the cottonwood fork. Elias Ward stopped by the wall and stood looking at it for a long time. "It handled the runoff," he said, and Roscoe heard the first crack in the man's certainty. But then Ward shook his head. "Runoff is not logs. Runoff is not boulders." "No," Roscoe said, "it is not. If real water comes and it catches on that nose, the whole thing becomes a dam, and a dam that breaks kills worse than a flood that runs clean." Roscoe knew this. He had thought about it every night for 3 weeks. The nose was smooth. Tomas had made sure of it. But a smooth nose and a log coming sideways at 15 miles an hour were 2 different arguments, and the log did not care about craftsmanship. Parcher sent word through a neighbor that if water touched Roscoe's cabin, the claim was finished, and the valley would belong to men with sense. He did not deliver the message himself. He did not need to. He was already waiting. Tomas prepared to leave. He repacked his burros at dawn, slow and careful, the way a man handles the last morning of something he does not want to end. He had stayed 3 weeks. He had come for water and rest, and given Roscoe the knowledge that separated a pile of rocks from a wall that might survive. Roscoe could not ask him to stay. Tomas had a daughter waiting. He had a journey north through mountain passes that would close if he delayed much longer. He had his own life, and lending 3 weeks of it to a stranger's wall was more than most men gave in a lifetime. But Roscoe stood at the apex and watched the old man cinch a load strap and felt the absence before it arrived. The silence where Tomas's quiet corrections had lived, the empty space where his hands had turned stones the right way, the missing voice that said better when something was good and said nothing when it was not. "You have enough wall," Tomas said. "The arms need capping, but the mass is there. If the water comes now, the wall will argue with it." "Argue is not the same as win," Roscoe said. "No, but it is better than silence." Tomas handed Roscoe a battered mason's line, a thin cord wound around a stick used for checking courses. It was nothing. It was everything. 41 years of acequia work wound around a piece of wood. A wall remembers every lazy stone, Tomas said. Then he climbed onto the lead burrow, adjusted the grandson's letter inside his shirt, and started north up the wash crossing. Roscoe watched him go until the burrows disappeared around the bend where the gulch met the main valley. Then he turned back to the unfinished right arm and picked up a stone. He was alone again. He had been alone before Tomas came, and it had not bothered him then because he had not known what company meant. Now he knew, and the knowing made the empty morning louder than any flood. The crisis arrived before dawn, on a night when warm rain fell on the snowpack above the basin. Roscoe woke not to water, but to sound, stones knocking together in the dark, deep, irregular, like a giant grinding teeth in restless sleep. Then the knocking merged into a continuous grinding, and beneath it rose a roar that was not wind and not thunder, and not anything Roscoe had heard in 58 years of living in the western mountains. He was off the bedroll and out the door before his knee had time to lock. The air was warm and wet and tasted of mud. Rain fell in straight sheets, not hard but steady, the kind that soaked instead of pounded. Above the rain, the roar swelled. Nate Ward came out of the darkness running. The boy was barefoot, coatless, carrying a lantern with the glass cracked. He was soaked through and shaking with something that was not entirely cold. He grabbed Roscoe's sleeve and said the words that changed the night from bad to impossible. "My sister is in our cabin. Papa went to move the stock uphill. She has the fever, and she cannot walk, and the water is already in the floor." The Ward cabin sat 200 yards downstream, on flat ground beside the wash. Lower than Roscoe's place, closer to the channel. No wall, no stone, no prow. Roscoe looked up the gulch. He could not see the flood in the darkness, but he could hear it, the grinding, the roaring, the deep percussion of boulders rolling against each other in the channel bed. It was coming. Not runoff, not high water, the full load of a warm rain on a mountain of snow, compressed into a valley throat no wider than a barn. He had seconds to decide. He could stay at the wall, at the apex, with the pry pole Tomas had left, and clear any debris that caught on the nose. That was the plan. That had always been the plan. The wall needed him at the point. Or he could leave the wall unmanned and carry a sick child through the dark while the valley came apart. Tomas had left the pry pole leaning against the apex. It was a 10-foot pine pole, sharpened at one end, heavy enough to lever a caught log free. Roscoe looked at the pole. He looked at Nate. "Show me," he said. They ran. Roscoe's knee screamed with every stride. Nate's cracked lantern threw a broken circle of light that jumped and swung and showed nothing useful. Wet grass, mud, a fence post, more mud. The roar was louder now. Roscoe could feel it through the ground, a vibration that climbed through the soles of his boots and settled in his teeth. They reached the Ward cabin as water began crawling through the floorboards. Not a surge, a seep, dark water pushing up between the planks like something alive feeling its way into a room. The girl lay on a straw tick near the fireplace, wrapped in quilts, her face flushed with fever, her eyes open and frightened. Roscoe scooped her up, quilts and all. She weighed almost nothing. The fever had burned through whatever weight she carried. He pressed her against his chest and told Nate to grip the back of his coat and not let go. They came out of the cabin into water that was ankle deep and moving. It had not been moving when they went in. 30 seconds. That was how fast the leading edge arrived. Roscoe turned uphill toward his own cabin, behind the wall's wide arms. Every step was a negotiation with mud that sucked at his boots, and a knee that tried to buckle, and a child whose heat he could feel through the quilts against his ribs. Behind them, the first real surge hit the lower valley. The sound was not a crash. It was a sustained, grinding compression. Water, mud, brush, ice, and logs pressed together into a moving wall that found everything in its path and carried it forward or broke it apart. Roscoe did not look back. He felt it. The ground shook. The air pressure changed. A wave of cold mist hit his neck. If you are invested in this story, stay with us, because the next few seconds decide whether that wall is a shield or a trap. They reached the lee of the right arm as the boar entered the upper gulch. Roscoe pushed Nate and the girl inside the cabin and turned to face the wall. In the dark, by lantern light and rain, the flood hit Roscoe Vale's stone prow. The boar was 10 feet at the wash throat. Mud, water, brush, ice, and whole trees compressed into a front that moved faster than a man could run. It struck the apex with a sound like a cannon firing into gravel, a deep percussive crack followed by a sustained roar as the current divided. The top 2 feet of water overtopped the wall in a brown sheet that poured over the capstones and ran down the inside face. But the mass of the boar, the heavy killing center of it, struck the nose and split. Left arm, right arm. 2 rivers where there had been one, accelerating along the stone faces, carrying logs and debris in parallel channels that roared past the cabin on both sides. A pine log struck the nose sideways. Roscoe saw it in the lantern light, 20 feet long, thick as a barrel, spinning. It hit the rounded granite and deflected left, riding the current down the left arm and disappearing into the dark. Another log hit, and another. Each one struck the nose and spun away because Tomas had made the point smooth, because the stones were rounded, because there were no ledges for a log end to catch and hold. Then one caught. A forked trunk, a cottonwood with a branch still attached, struck the apex, and the fork straddled the nose like a hand gripping a post. The branch held. The trunk swung sideways. Debris began piling behind it. Water climbed. Tomas was there. The old man had not left. He had made camp at the wash crossing, and when the roar began, he had come back. He stood at the apex with the pry pole, knee-deep in brown water that surged around his legs, and drove the sharpened end under the forked trunk. He levered. The trunk shifted. He levered again. The fork cracked. The cottonwood spun free, and the debris behind it flushed down the left channel in a brown slurry that carried branches, ice, mud, and a fence post from someone's ruined claim. Water poured over the top of the apex in a continuous sheet. The through-stones held the 2 faces together. The hearting did not dance. The batter pressed the wall's weight inward. Every lesson Tomas had taught was being tested simultaneously, and every lesson was holding. But the right arm was failing. Roscoe saw it in the lantern light. Muddy water boiling up behind the base stones at the right arm's downstream end, where he had never finished the scour apron. The flood had found bare gravel and was digging, undermining, creating a hole beneath the wall that would grow until the stones above it fell inward, and the current poured through the breach straight at the cabin. Elias Ward appeared from the dark, soaked, wild-eyed, his stock abandoned uphill. He had come for his children and found them behind Roscoe's wall. He saw the scour and understood it without being told. "What do we put in it?" Ward shouted over the roar. "Anything heavy." They threw rubble. They threw brush bundles. They threw sacks of gravel that Roscoe had piled near the cabin for future harding. Roscoe and Ward worked side by side in waist-deep water at the base of the right arm, while the flood screamed past them on the other side of the stones. The rubble caught. The brush fascine snagged against the base stones and held. The scour slowed. It did not stop, but it slowed, and slowing was enough. Bellamy appeared on horseback at the edge of the protected zone, his dun mare chest deep in the overflow that crested the arms. He had ridden down from the bench road to check the lower cabins and found them gone. One timber cabin had lifted from its sill logs, turned sideways, and disappeared downstream. His own county storage shed had burst open, tools and records scattering into the mud. He sat the mare in Roscoe's yard, the yard that was wet but not wrecked, muddy but not destroyed. And for the first time in his life, he did what another man told him to do. "Get off the horse!" Roscoe shouted. "Help us fill this hole." Bellamy dismounted and filled the hole. Downstream, the contrast was visible even in darkness. Straight-facing cabins took the flood square. Walls that met the current broadside shattered. A freestanding shed broke apart and spun into the current in pieces. Parcher's newly bought claim shack, set against a cut bank with no relief path, was crushed by a debris jam that piled logs against its upstream wall until the wall folded inward and the cabin disappeared into the pile. At the apex, Tomas was in trouble. A rolling log had pinned him knee-deep, the current pressing the timber against his legs with a force he could not break alone. Roscoe left the right arm and waded to the nose. The water was chest-high against the wall's upstream face, pouring over the top in a continuous brown curtain. Roscoe found the pry pole tumbling in the overflow, grabbed it, and drove it under the log. Ward was beside him. Together they levered the log off the old man's legs. Tomas staggered back, his face white. His left knee was bent at an angle that knees should not bend, but he was upright, and the log spun free into the left channel, and the apex still stood. The pry pole was gone. The current took it. The wall shuddered. Roscoe felt it through the soles of his boots. A deep, skeletal vibration as the flood's full mass pressed against the stone and the stone pressed back. Hardened stones rattled inside the wall like bones in a bucket. Capstones shifted. One toppled from the right arm and splashed into the scour hole they had just filled. But the through stones held. The batter held. The mass held. Tons of granite set with their long teeth into the wall's depth, packed dead with harding that did not dance, resting on a foundation trench dug to packed gravel. Tomas's lessons, every one of them, standing between the flood and a cabin that should have been kindling. The cabin behind the wide end sat in muddy calm. Water seeped through the wall's joints and ran through the swale Roscoe had dug, draining under the raised floor. The main violence passed on both sides. The arms gave the water somewhere to go, and the water went. Roscoe stood in his yard, knee-deep in seepage, and watched the flood roar past on both sides of his life. The girl with the fever slept on his bedroll inside the cabin. Nate pressed against the doorframe, staring. Ward stood beside Roscoe with mud to his waist, and nothing in his expression except the silence of a man whose argument has been answered. The crisis did not end cleanly. The bore passed, but the high water held for hours. The right arm continued to seep at its base. A second surge at dawn brought a fresh load of mud that raised the water level another foot and overtopped the left arm in 2 places. Roscoe and Ward spent the hours before sunrise shoring the weak points with everything they could lift. Then, near full light, Roscoe heard shouting from downstream. Gideon Parcher, trying to save his ledger box from the wreckage of his storehouse, had been swept from the porch by a secondary surge. He was caught on a cottonwood root, his arms locked around it, the current dragging his legs downstream while the root bent under his weight. Roscoe took the rope from his cabin. He waded out of the protected eddy into the current. Ward held the rope's tail. Roscoe braced against the left arm's outer face and threw. The rope landed across Parcher's chest. Parcher grabbed it with one hand, then both, and Roscoe and Ward hauled him through the shallows into the calm behind the wall. Parcher lay in the mud of Roscoe's yard, coughing brown water, his ledger box gone, his claims gone, his certainty gone. Roscoe stood over him with the rope still in his hands and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the mud and the water in the standing cabin were not already saying. The wall had never been only for Roscoe. He had not known that when he built it. He knew it now. Morning came gray and wet and quiet in a way that felt like an apology. The roar had dropped to a steady hiss. The wash still ran brown and fast, but the killing surge had passed, and what remained was aftermath, the slow, exhausted bleeding of a mountain that had thrown everything it carried at the valley below, and now had nothing left. Roscoe stood at the apex of his wall and looked at what the flood had written. On both sides of the V, the water had gouged channels deep enough to swallow a wagon wheel. Gravel, mud, and shattered timber lined the banks in heaps that steamed in the cool air. Downstream, where the two channels rejoined and continued into the main valley, whole cabins had been reduced to timber piles. Sill logs lay scattered like dropped sticks. A cook stove sat upright in the middle of the wash, 40 yards from the nearest foundation, its pipe still attached and pointing at the sky as if waiting for someone to light a fire. Behind the wall, inside the wide arms of the V, Roscoe's cabin stood. Mud stains reached the bottom step. The raised floor was damp but not flooded. Water had seeped through the wall's joints, run through the swale, and drained under the cabin exactly as Roscoe had designed. The yard was wet. The yard was not destroyed. On the windowsill, where Roscoe had set it the evening before, a coffee cup sat upright. Dried silt ringed its base. The cup had not moved. Nate Ward saw it first. He was standing in the cabin doorway with his sister wrapped in quilts behind him, and he looked at the cup and then looked at the valley beyond the wall's arms, and his face did something that 12-year-old faces should not have to do. It tried to hold two truths at once, that the world had nearly ended and that a cup of coffee had survived it. Horace Bellamy came back at mid-morning. He came on foot this time. The dun mare was tied uphill, and Bellamy walked the wash with his measuring chain, though he did not measure anything. He walked the left arm from end to apex, then the right arm from apex to end. He stopped at each point where water had overtopped the wall and studied the capstones. He crouched at the right arm's base where the scour had nearly breached and examined the emergency fill. The rubble and brush fascines that Roscoe and Ward had thrown in during the worst hours. He stood at the apex for a long time. The upstream nose was scarred. Bark from impacting logs had been stripped across the granite in long, pale streaks. One stone at the very point was cracked, split by a blow heavy enough to fracture solid rock, but it had not shifted. The through stones on either side held it in place. Bellamy touched the crack with his fingers. He traced the bark scars. He put his palm on the nose the way Tomas had taught Roscoe to check for snags, and his hand slid across stone that had taken the full force of a debris flood and answered it with geometry. "I told you a boot was not a flood," Bellamy said. "I was right. It took a mountain of stone." He paused. His hand stayed on the wall. "And you said it right." Roscoe said nothing. He was sitting on the cabin step, too exhausted to stand, his knee swollen to twice its normal size, his hands cracked and bleeding, Mud dried into every crease of his body. He did not need Bellamy's approval. He had needed the wall to work, and the wall had worked. But Bellamy's words mattered in a way that Roscoe's silence could not dismiss, because Bellamy was the voice the Gulch listened to, and what Bellamy said at the supply shed this afternoon would determine whether Roscoe Vale remained a fool or became something else. Bellamy coiled his measuring chain. He looked at the cabin, at the cup on the sill, at the scoured channels on both sides. "How did you know?" he asked. "Driftwood," Roscoe said. 8 feet up in a cottonwood fork, and a quiet place in the silt behind the tree where the flood had gone around. Bellamy stared at him. "You built all of this because of a piece of wood stuck in a tree." "I built all of this because the wood told me the river had been here before, and nobody else was listening." Bellamy left without another word, but he left on foot, and a man who walks out of a place instead of riding leaves a different weight behind him. He had come to see. He had seen. What he did with it now was between him and the Gulch. A freight driver named Loomis passed through that afternoon, hauling supplies from Fairplay to the lower camps. His wagon rode crossed the wash a quarter-mile below Roscoe's claim, and the crossing was gone. Washed out, the gravel bed scoured down to bedrock, the cottonwoods on both banks leaning at angles that said they would fall by next storm. Loomis walked up to see the damage and stopped when he reached the wall. He stood between the arms of the V and looked upstream at the apex, then downstream at the cabin, then at the gouged channels on both sides. "The current split like a team partying around a post," Loomis said. He was not a man of science. He was a man who drove mules and understood what a force did when it met an obstacle. The comparison was the best validation Roscoe had received, because it came from someone who had no stake in being right or wrong. It came from someone who simply saw what had happened and described it. Elias Ward came next. He carried his daughter on his hip, the girl Roscoe had carried through the dark, and he walked the wall the way Bellamy had, slowly, touching stones, checking joints. He stopped at the right arm where the scour had nearly breached and looked at the emergency fill. "I threw half of that," Ward said. "You did." Ward looked at his daughter. She was still flushed with fever, but awake, her small hand gripping his collar. He looked at the wall. He looked at Roscoe. "I thought it was a waste," Ward said, "until my children stood dry behind it." He did not apologize. Frontiermen did not apologize for honest doubt, but he offered something better. "Show me how you read the flood marks. Show me which ones matter." It was the first request. There would be more. By the second day, people came to the wall the way people come to a thing they do not yet understand but cannot ignore. They came singly at first, then in pairs, then in small groups that stood between the arms, and looked at the channels on both sides and tried to reconcile what they saw with what they had believed. The measurable facts were hard to argue with. Roscoe's yard held 3 inches of silt. The Ward cabin site, 200 yards downstream with no protection, held 3 feet. Parcher's storage wall was gone entirely, the foundation stones scattered downstream like teeth knocked from a jaw. The stone wall had lost several capstones and part of the right arm scour apron, but the main structure had not breached. The apex stood. The arms stood. The through stones, the hearting, the batter, the rounded nose. Everything Thomas had taught, everything Roscoe had bled into granite, stood. People asked questions Roscoe had never expected to answer. Where should a cabin sit relative to a wash? How high should a floor be raised? How far from the channel was safe? How did you read old debris marks? What did driftwood height tell you about flood history? Roscoe answered all of them. He did not charge. He did not lecture. He crouched in wet silt and drew diagrams with a stick. V shapes, angled berms, escape swales, raised floor pads. He showed people the cottonwood fork where the driftwood had lodged, and explained that any mark higher than a man's head meant the wash had carried a killing flood within living memory. Do not ask the river where it is during drought, Roscoe said. Ask where it has been when angry. It was not a philosophy, it was a surveying method. Walk the wash, read the scars, build accordingly. Two families began planning new cabin sites that same week. One moved 200 paces up the slope. The other stayed low but raised the floor on stone piers and cut a spill path behind the cabin, a shallow trench that would carry overflow around the structure instead of through it. Neither built a V-wall. That was the point. The wall was Roscoe's answer to Roscoe's specific problem. The lesson was broader. Read the land before you build. Gideon Parcher did not come to the wall. He had been pulled from the cottonwood root with brown water in his lungs and humiliation in his ledger. His storehouse was destroyed. His newly bought claims were wrecked. The families he had lent flour and nails to, the families whose debts he had converted into land, were now homeless, and their anger had a name and a face, and it was not the river's. Parcher retreated to his remaining building, a cabin on higher ground he had kept as a residence while using the storehouse as his base of operations. He told anyone who would listen that Roscoe's wall had redirected water into other cabins, that the V-shape had channeled the flood's force toward properties that would have survived if the current had been allowed to spread naturally across the wash. It was a dangerous claim because grief needs someone to blame, and a man with a wall that survived while others lost everything made an easy target. Bellamy killed the accusation at the supply shed. He stood on the porch where men gathered and laid out the facts the way a road overseer lays out a survey, with measurements, with precedent, with the calm certainty of a man who has walked the ground. The destroyed cabins sat in the natural wash path. They had always sat in the natural wash path. The flood would have taken them with or without Roscoe's wall, because they were built on flat ground 40 yards from the channel, with nothing between their doors and the current except hope. Vale's wall divided the flood around his own claim, Bellamy said. It did not dam the valley. The channels it created run where the water would have gone anyway, along the natural wash line. If anything, the wall reduced the debris load downstream by shedding logs to both sides before they could mass into a jam. He looked at Parcher, who stood at the back of the group with his arms crossed. The cabins that failed were not Vale's fault. They were ours. We built where it was flat and easy, and told ourselves the river had forgotten the way. Parcher said nothing. He did not have the measurements to argue with Bellamy, and he did not have the standing. His own property had been destroyed. His own judgment had been wrong. The man he had tried to buy out for $20 was the only man in the gulch whose cabin still stood with a coffee cup on the sill. But Parcher did not concede. He retreated. A man like Parcher never concedes when he can retreat, because retreat preserves the possibility of a future attack, and Parcher was a man who thought in futures. Tomas Villard sat in Roscoe's cabin with his left leg splinted and his face the color of old ash. The log that had pinned him at the apex had done more than bruise. The knee was torn inside, ligaments or cartilage, or something that frontier medicine had no name for, but that expressed itself as swelling, heat, and a pain that made the old man's jaw clench when he thought no one was looking. Roscoe had carried him into the cabin after the flood's main force passed. He had splinted the leg with axe handles and rawhide strips. He had boiled willow bark for the pain and made broth from the last of the beans. He had given Tomas his own bedroll and slept on the floor, and he had not said what both of them knew, that Tomas had come back because he could not leave a wall unfinished, and the wall had nearly killed him for it. Tomas stayed through the first week of aftermath. He could not walk, but he could talk, and what he taught from the bedroll was different from what he had taught at the wall. He taught repair. "The scour on the right arm," Tomas said. "Wider toe stones, heavier. Dig the apron trench deeper and set the first course below the scour line so the water cannot find gravel to chew." He drew diagrams on the cabin floor with a charcoal stick, his hand steady even when his face showed pain. "And the capstones that fell. Set them with a lip on the upstream side so water pours over the top instead of catching under the edge and lifting them free." Roscoe rebuilt the scoured section in the second week. This time Nate helped, not with a bucket of harding stones, but with real work, dragging stones on the sled, fitting base courses, packing rubble into the core. Roscoe taught the boy what Tomas had taught him: length into the wall, dead hearting, batter inward, protect the toe. Tomas watched from the cabin door. Propped on a crutch Roscoe had carved from a cottonwood branch. He watched Roscoe teaching and Nate learning, and something in his face settled. Not happiness, not satisfaction, but the particular calm of a man who sees his knowledge moving from hand to hand and knows it will outlive him. "The boy listens," Tomas said one evening. "The boy has reason to," Roscoe said. "He carried a broken lantern through the mud to save his sister. A boy who does that listens when you show him how to save more." Tomas left on a clear morning in late May. His burros were packed. His leg was splinted with a proper brace Roscoe had built from oak and leather. He could ride, but not walk far. And the journey north to his daughter's house near Denver would take 2 weeks if the passes were clear and longer if they were not. Before he mounted, he handed Roscoe the mason's line, the same line he had used for 41 years of acequia work, a thin cord wound around a smooth stick, darkened with age and the oil of 10,000 adjustments. "I gave you this before," Tomas said. "You gave it back when I returned. Keep it this time." Roscoe took the line. It weighed nothing. It meant the world. "A wall remembers every lazy stone," Tomas said. It was the same thing he had said before he left the first time, and it was the same thing because it was still true and would always be true, and no amount of flood or survival or victory changed the fact that craft was the foundation of everything. Roscoe held the mason's line and watched the burros start north. He did not follow. He did not call out. He stood at the apex of his wall, in the quiet pocket behind the wide arms, and held a piece of cord that connected him to a man who had stopped for water and stayed to build something that saved lives. The news came in August, in a folded letter carried by a freight driver from the San Luis Valley. Tomas Velarde had died in his daughter's house 3 weeks after arriving. The fever from the injured knee had settled into his blood. He had been buried beside his wife in the churchyard at San Luis, under a stone that his grandson had set. Nate Ward read the letter aloud in Roscoe's cabin because Roscoe's hands were shaking too badly to hold the paper, and his eyes were too blurred to read the words. The boy read slowly, carefully, the way a person reads something they know matters more than they can understand. When he finished, Roscoe took the letter and folded it and put it inside the cabin wall, between 2 stones near the fireplace, where the paper would stay dry and dark, and close to the structure Tomas had taught him to build. He wrapped the mason's line around his right hand and went back to work on the south arm extension. There was nothing else to do with grief except give it to the stones. The secondary crisis came in August, fast and mean, and without the courtesy of warning. A cloudburst broke over the upper basin on an afternoon when the sky changed from blue to black in less than an hour. Not a snowmelt flood this time. A summer storm that dumped 2 inches of rain in 40 minutes onto slopes that were still raw from the spring runoff, stripped of brush, scoured to bare rock that shed water like tin. The flash flood was smaller than the spring event, but faster. It hit the wash while several families were rebuilding in the lower valley. Elias Ward and two neighbors had just laid sill logs for a new cabin on a site Roscoe had helped them choose, higher than the old one, with a spill path cut behind it and the floor planned for stone piers. But the temporary diversion they had built to protect the construction site was failing. The neighbors had used rounded river stones for the base instead of angular ones. Tomas had warned Roscoe about this. Rounded stones rolled under pressure. They found no purchase against each other. The current pushed them loose the way a hand pushes marbles across a table. Roscoe arrived at the site as brown water began curling around the diversion's upstream end. The rounded base stones were shifting, rocking, the wall losing its foundation one smooth stone at a time. He did not have Tomas. He did not have the quiet voice that said better, or the steady hands that turned stones the right way. He had the lessons. He had the mason's line wound around his hand. He had the memory of every correction, every crouch demonstration, every morning of pulling stones and resetting them because the first attempt was wrong. "Pull the round stones," Roscoe ordered. "Everyone, replace them with angular pieces from the talus slope. Flat bottoms, rough faces, long axes into the wall." Ward and the neighbors stared at him. The water was rising. "Now," Roscoe said. They pulled stones while the current climbed. They replaced them with angular granite that locked against its neighbors instead of rolling. Roscoe set the new base course himself, on his knees in 6 inches of moving water, his bad knee grinding against gravel while he fitted each stone with the care Tomas had demanded, length into the wall, tight joints, no rocking. The diversion held. The flash flood peaked and passed within 2 hours, leaving mud and debris but no destroyed structures. The new cabin's sill log sat untouched. The spill path behind the site carried overflow around the construction zone exactly as designed. Ward looked at the rebuilt diversion base, and then at Roscoe, who was sitting in the mud with his knee locked and his hands bleeding, and the mason's line still wound around his right hand. "Tomas taught you that," Ward said. "Tomas taught me all of it," Roscoe said. "If this story reminds you why preparation matters before anyone believes you, share it with someone who needs to hear it." The weeks after the cloudburst changed the way the Gulch treated Roscoe Vale. He had been a fool, then a survivor, then a curiosity. Now he was the man you asked before you built. Families came to him with site questions, not just where to place a cabin, but how to read a wash, how to judge a slope, how to tell the difference between a safe flat and a dangerous one. Roscoe walked their claims with them. He showed them flood scars on trees. He showed them old cutbank lines where the channel had once chewed. He showed them driftwood lodged in places that told the story of water that had passed through before anyone alive had been watching. He taught Elias Ward to set the long axis of stones into a wall instead of along it. He taught Nate to listen for hollow hearting by tapping the wall face with an iron rod. A solid wall rang dull. A hollow wall rang bright, and the brightness was a warning. He taught 2 widows who had lost their cabins in the spring flood to raise a new floor on stone pads and cut a shallow drainage swale behind it so seepage drained away instead of pooling. He taught Bellamy to read watermarks before laying a road. The road overseer had spent 9 years building crossings where the ground was convenient, not where the water was safe. After seeing Roscoe's wall and the scoured channels beside it, Bellamy began walking wash lines before he set a single timber, checking debris heights, noting where the current had carved and where it had deposited. It added time to every project. It saved every crossing he built from that point forward. Roscoe did not ask for payment. He did not want it. What he wanted was harder to name. The sense that what he had built and what Tomas had taught him and what Alonzo Moya had shown him 29 years ago in an acequia ditch would outlive all three of them. Knowledge moved through hands, not ledgers. It survived in the people who learned it, in the walls they built, and the floods they read before the floods arrived. But survival had not removed Gideon Parcher from the valley, and knowledge had not made Parcher less dangerous. It had made him adaptable. Parcher's adaptation arrived in early autumn, wrapped in enterprise. He had lost his storehouse, his best claims, and his reputation as a man who understood the gulch better than anyone in it. What he had not lost was his understanding of how to profit from other people's fear. Within weeks of the spring flood, Parcher began selling what he called Vale pattern flood lots. He identified low-lying claims near the wash, cheap properties that the flood had made even cheaper, and marketed them to incoming settlers with a specific promise. A stone V-wall built to Roscoe Vale's design, included in the purchase price. The walls he built were nothing like Roscoe's. They were low, 3 feet instead of 6. They were thin, 4 feet at the base instead of 8. They used rounded river stones instead of angular granite because river stones were free and granite required hauling. The hearting was loose rubble dumped without packing. There were no through stones. There was no scour apron. The upstream noses were blunt and rough, with ledges where any passing log would catch and hold. They were decorations shaped like defenses, and they would fail at the first serious test. Roscoe confronted Parcher on the road outside the gulch, where the freight wagons turned toward Fairplay. Parcher was riding with a prospective buyer, a young man with a wife and a new baby, looking for affordable land near water. "The lots you are selling sit in the scour zone," Roscoe said. "The walls you're building will not hold ankle-deep runoff, much less a flood." Parcher smiled the way a man smiles when he has an audience. "Vale, not every man can afford to spend his spring stacking a mountain of rock. My buyers get protection that is practical and affordable. Your buyers get a pile of round stones that will roll apart the first time water touches them." The young buyer looked between them, uncertain. Parcher put a hand on the man's shoulder, a gesture of ownership disguised as reassurance. "Vale built one wall and thinks he owns the river. I'm offering families a chance to live safely near water at a price they can afford." Roscoe looked at the young man. He saw what he had been 2 years ago. Broke, desperate, willing to believe whatever made the math work. "The wall does not forgive a foolish sight," Roscoe said. "It only gives a wise one a chance." Parcher rode off with the buyer. Roscoe stood in the road with the mason's line wound around his hand, and the knowledge that being right was not the same as being heard, and that a man who sold comfort would always outsell a man who offered truth. The wall Parcher built for the Alden family failed on a night in October when nobody expected water. A 3-day rain had soaked the upper basin, not dramatic, not violent, just steady and patient the way water is patient when it has already found the path. The wash rose 2 feet in an hour. Not a flood, not a crisis. Ordinary high water that any sound structure should have turned without effort. Parcher's wall met the current and came apart. The round river stones at the base rolled under pressure, exactly as Roscoe had warned. The wall's face bulged outward where loose hearting shifted behind it. Water found the gaps between unkeyed stones and poured through in a dozen separate streams. The blunt upstream nose caught a tangle of brush and small logs, and the debris dam raised the water level until the current overtopped the wall and poured into the Alden cabin from both sides simultaneously. Nobody died. The water was knee-deep, not killing deep. But the cabin floor was ruined. The family's flower stores were soaked. The baby's cradle floated against the far wall and lodged there, empty, because Sarah Alden had snatched the child from it 30 seconds before the water reached the mattress. The reason nobody died was not the wall. It was Marta Rios and Nate Ward. Marta had seen the rain building for 2 days and had walked the lower claims to check on the new families. She had looked at Parcher's wall and known it was wrong, not because she was a mason, but because she had spent enough time around Roscoe's work to recognize what honest stone looked like and what decorated gravel looked like. She had told the Aldens to sleep uphill until the rain stopped. Sarah Alden had refused because the cabin was warm and the hillside was not, and besides, Mr. Parcher had promised the wall would hold. Nate had come back at dusk and told them again. The boy was 14 now, taller, quieter, with hands that were starting to look like a man's hands. He did not argue. He said, "My father thought the same thing about Roscoe's wall, and he was wrong. Please sleep uphill tonight." Sarah Alden looked at the boy's face and saw something in it that Parcher's reassurance did not contain. She carried the baby uphill. Her husband followed with blankets. They slept under a tarp in light rain and woke to the sound of water entering their cabin. The morning after the failure, Roscoe walked the wreckage with Bellamy. The wall had not simply failed. It had failed in every way Roscoe had predicted. Round-based stones rolled and scattered downstream. Loose hearting spilled from the split face like grain from a torn sack. The blunt nose had caught debris and dammed the flow instead of shedding it. The absent scour apron had let the current dig under the foundation and collapse the upstream face into the hole. Bellamy measured the damage with his chain, not because measurement was necessary, but because measurement was what Bellamy did when he was angry and needed his hands to be busy. He paced the ruin 3 times. He wrote numbers in a small book. He closed the book and put it in his coat. "This is not Vale's design," Bellamy said. "This is a drawing of Vale's design made by a man who looked at it from the road and thought he understood what he was seeing." He rode to Parcher's cabin that afternoon. The conversation was not public, but its result was. Bellamy told Parcher that he had 2 choices: refund the Alden family's payment in full, or face a formal complaint before the land office in fair play. A complaint would mean a hearing. A hearing would mean testimony. Testimony would mean Roscoe, Ward, Bellamy, and the Aldens all describing under oath what Parcher had sold and what it had done. Parcher refunded the payment. He did it with a face that said he was buying silence, not admitting fault. But the money changed hands, and the Aldens used it to buy a site on higher ground that Roscoe helped them choose, and Parcher's Vale pattern floodlots were never mentioned again in Clearwater Gulch. The humiliation was not dramatic. There was no public reckoning, no shouted confrontation, no moment where the villain fell to his knees. Parcher simply became smaller. His credit dried up as families learned that his judgments about land were not judgments at all, but calculations about profit, and that the difference between the two was the distance between a cabin standing and a cabin floating. He kept his high ground residence. He kept his remaining stock. But the leverage he had built, the web of debt and dependency that let him convert other men's failures into his own holdings, dissolved like the round stones of his wall, one smooth piece at a time. Years later, Parcher would nod to Roscoe on the road. Not friendship, not respect. The grudging acknowledgement of a man who had bet against the river and lost. Marta Rios arrived in Clearwater Gulch in the spring of 1874, the same season as the Great Flood, though she and Roscoe did not meet until the rebuilding weeks that followed. She had come from Pueblo with a dead husband's tools and a living woman's refusal to stop. Her smokehouse had been one of the first structures destroyed. She had built it herself the previous autumn. Squared logs, a stone firebox, a plank door she had hung on leather hinges because iron ones cost more than she could spare. The flood took it in the first surge. She found the firebox stones scattered 100 yards downstream, still warm from the last smoking she had done the day before. She did not weep where anyone could see. She walked the debris field, collected what she could, and began planning the replacement before the mud had dried. Roscoe met her at the wall. She had come to see it the way everyone had, but she did not stand between the arms and stare. She walked the outside, studying the base, the batter, the way the stones interlocked. She crouched at the scoured section Roscoe had rebuilt and ran her hand along the new toe stones. "The repair is tighter than the original," she said. Roscoe looked at her. Most visitors praised the wall or questioned it. Nobody had looked closely enough to distinguish the repair from the original work. "Tomas taught me better the second time," Roscoe said. "Who is Tomas?" Roscoe told her. "Not the whole story, not yet, but enough. The acequia mason from the San Luis Valley. The 3 days that became 3 weeks. The lessons taught through hands. The log that pinned him at the apex. The letter that came in August." Marta listened the way a person listens when they recognize the shape of a loss they carry themselves. She did not offer comfort. She offered labor. "I need to rebuild my smokehouse," she said. "I need a stone foundation that will not move when water comes. I will trade you 4 days of roof work for your help setting the base." It was the first honest trade Roscoe had been offered since arriving in the gulch. Not charity, not pity. An exchange between two people who each had something the other needed. They built the smokehouse foundation together over 4 days. Marta mixed lime wash from creek clay and ash and applied it to the cabin's exterior walls, a technique Roscoe had never seen that sealed the gaps between logs better than any chinking he had tried. She showed him how to set roof poles at a steeper pitch to shed snow load, and how to notch them at the ridge so they locked against each other instead of resting on top. Roscoe set her smokehouse base with angular stones, length into the wall, tight hearting, a small berm on the upstream side to divert runoff. It was not a V-wall. It was the principle applied at small scale, reading the land, respecting the water, placing stone where it could do the most good with the least mass. Their partnership formed through work, not words. Marta had practical knowledge that Roscoe lacked: food preservation, roof repair, lime wash, the organization of a household that did not merely survive, but functioned. Roscoe had stone, water, and the hard-bought understanding of how a valley moved when it was angry. Together, their skills covered the ground that each alone could not reach. Marta challenged Roscoe the first time his knee locked during a wall repair, and he tried to keep working. She stood in front of him and said, "A man who ruins his leg finishing a wall today cannot walk the wash tomorrow. Sit down." He sat, not because she was right, though she was, but because the voice was the first one since Tomas that spoke to him with the authority of someone who cared whether he was alive in the morning. Their bond grew through the summer and autumn of '75. Roscoe helped Marta rebuild her cabin on a site she chose herself, higher, with a spill path, with the floor on stone piers. Marta kept records of wall repairs in a small book she had salvaged from the debris. Dates, sections, which stones had shifted, which joints had opened. She turned Roscoe's instinct into documentation. The documentation turned individual memory into something that could be shared, taught, and checked. By winter, they were sharing meals without pretending it was about labor exchange. By spring, they were sharing a cabin without pretending it was about efficiency. They married in the summer of 1876, quietly, with Bellamy and Ward as witnesses, and Nate Ward standing behind them looking pleased in the way a boy looks pleased when adults finally do the obvious thing. They were older than the usual frontier newlyweds, more practical than sentimental. Their courtship had been built from shared work, stone and lime wash and roof poles, and the daily maintenance of structures that kept a valley's water from becoming a valley's enemy. What held them together was not romance in the way the word is usually meant. It was the deeper thing that romance sometimes becomes when two people have each survived enough to know what matters. The knowledge that someone will be there when the water rises, not because they promised, but because they already proved it. By the late 1870s, Clearwater Gulch had changed in ways that were visible to anyone passing through. 5 homesteads used some version of Roscoe's principles. Not all of them were V-walls. The V-wall was Roscoe's answer to Roscoe's specific problem, a cabin sitting 40 yards from a wash in a narrow valley throat. Other families had different problems and needed different answers. The Aldens, resettled on higher ground, had raised their cabin floor on stone piers 2 feet above grade and cut a drainage swale behind the foundation. No wall at all, just elevation and escape. When the spring runoff of 77 came through heavier than usual, water ran under the cabin and out the swale without touching the floorboards. Ward had rebuilt his cabin 200 paces from the wash, on a bench that Roscoe showed him was above the highest flood scar on the cottonwoods. He used the lower ground only for grazing. His stock could move, his family could not. The distinction saved the problem of protection entirely by removing the thing that needed protecting from the place that threatened it. 2 widows on the east side of the gulch had built a low-angled berm, not a V, but a single arm that deflected runoff away from their shared cabin and into a natural drainage that fed back into the wash below the settlement. Roscoe had drawn the angle in the dirt. Nate had helped set the base stones. The berm was 4 feet high and 40 feet long, and it solved their problem completely because their problem was not a direct flood strike, but a side channel overflow that could be redirected with a fraction of the mass Roscoe's wall required. Each solution was different. Each solution was correct. The important lesson was not copying the shape blindly, it was reading the land before building. Marta organized a spring inspection day. Every thaw, before the runoff peak, families walked the valley together. They checked walls and berms for shifted stones. They cleared brush from overflow paths. They marked any new scars the water had left during winter. They noted where the channel had moved, where new gravel bars had formed, where old cut banks had deepened. The inspection was not Roscoe's idea, it was Marta's. She had understood something Roscoe had not articulated, that a wall built once and forgotten was a wall waiting to fail. Maintenance was not repair, it was reading. Every season the water wrote new information on the valley, and the only defense against surprise was paying attention. Roscoe taught. He taught anyone who asked and some who did not. He walked claims with newcomers and showed them the driftwood forks, the cut bank lines, the flood scars that told the valley's water history in a language most people had never learned to read. He drew V-shapes in the dirt when V-shapes were the answer. He drew berms when berms were the answer. He drew raised foundations and spill paths and drainage swales when those were the answers. And sometimes he drew nothing at all and simply pointed uphill and said, "Build there." Nate Ward became his best student. The boy had grown into a young man with steady hands and an ear for stone. He could tap a wall face with an iron rod and tell by the sound whether the hearting was packed dead or dancing loose. He carried a bucket of angular hearting stones to the wall long after he was old enough to carry a man's weight, because the habit had become part of who he was, the way his father's stubbornness was part of Elias, and Roscoe's limp was part of Roscoe. By the early 1880s, Nate had begun building road crossings in the next valley over, using principles he had learned at the wall: angular base stones, tight hearting, scour aprons, pointed upstream noses where debris was likely. He never called it Roscoe's method. He called it common sense, which was the highest compliment a frontier man could give a technique, wang, the acknowledgement that it had stopped being someone's idea and become everyone's knowledge. The years compress the way years do when the crisis has passed, and what remains is the daily work of living. Roscoe's knee never healed fully. The swelling became permanent. He walked with a stiffness that worsened in cold weather and eased in summer. And he carried Tomas's mason's line wrapped around his right hand so often that the cord left a faint groove in his skin, a callus that mapped the shape of the line the way the cottonwood fork mapped the shape of the flood. He and Marta raised no children of their own. They were too old when they married, and the frontier did not forgive late starts in that particular endeavor, but they raised the Gulch's children in the way that mattered, teaching them to read water, to respect stone, to walk a wash in spring, and listen to what the valley said before they drove a nail or set a log. Bellamy, the authority skeptic who had measured the wash and pronounced Roscoe a fool, became the man who sent travelers to Roscoe before they chose claim sites. He retired as road overseer in 1881 and spent his remaining years on the bench above the gulch, watching the valley he had helped govern change shape beneath him. He never built a wall himself. He never needed to. His contribution was simpler and perhaps more valuable. He stopped arguing with the man who had been right. Elias Ward farmed his relocated cabin until his children were grown, and then he farmed it some more. His relationship with Roscoe never became friendship in the way the word is usually meant. It became something more durable, the mutual respect of two men who had stood in waist-deep water throwing rubble into a hole while the mountain tried to kill them. They did not visit for pleasure. They did not share meals for companionship. They nodded on the road and helped when help was needed, and left each other alone the rest of the time, which on the frontier was the deepest form of trust. Roscoe repaired the wall every spring. He added to it in small ways, a higher capstone here, a wider toe there, a new fascine bundle at the apex where the old ones had rotted. The wall was not a monument. It was a living structure, changing with each season, responding to each flood's new information. The stones settled. The harding packed tighter. The scour apron accumulated sediment that armored the ground in front of the nose. Each year, the wall became more itself. Marta kept the record book. Dates, sections, repairs, observations. She noted when capstones shifted, when joints opened, when new scour appeared at unexpected points. The book grew thick and water-stained and became the valley's memory, a written record of what the river did and what the stone answered. The last image of Roscoe Vale that the valley remembered was this: an evening in late spring 1896. The runoff that year was mild, an ordinary thaw, nothing dramatic, water running clean and steady in the wash the way it did most years when the snowpack melted at the pace the mountains intended. Roscoe sat on the flat stone he had placed at the apex years ago as a seat, a broad granite slab set into the wall's upstream face at sitting height, worn smooth by weather and by use. He sat there most evenings when his knee allowed, watching the wash, watching the water divide at the point and curl down both arms in the pattern he had designed 22 years earlier. Children who had never seen the great flood climbed on the wall's lower stones. They scrambled along the arms and jumped from capstone to capstone and used the scour apron as a wading pool when the runoff was shallow enough. They did not know what the wall was for. They knew only that it was made of stone and that climbing stone was better than climbing anything else. Marta came out of the cabin and called them down, not sharply. She was never sharp with children, but with the firmness of a woman who knew that the stones they played on had been set with blood, and that moving them was not a game. Roscoe did not call them down. He watched them climb and felt something that was not quite pride and not quite sadness, but lived in the space between. The wall was doing its job. The children did not need to know. The wall did not need their understanding. It needed only to stand. A boy, the youngest Alden child born after the flood, raised on higher ground, pointed at the cottonwood tree above the wall. The fork still held a piece of driftwood, gray now, weathered but lodged tight. Below it, bark scars from the flood had healed into rough ridges that the tree would carry for the rest of its life. "What is that?" the boy asked, pointing at the driftwood. Roscoe looked up at the fork. 8 feet above the ground, a polished log that a river had placed there on a night when the valley learned what water could do. "That," Roscoe said, "is where the river wrote its name." Marta called the children again. They scrambled down and ran toward the cabin, laughing, their feet bare on stone that had held against a mountain's fury. Roscoe watched them go. Then he looked at the wash, where clean water split at the nose and curled away on both sides, quiet and obedient and utterly patient. He wrapped the mason's line tighter around his hand and sat with the wall until the light went blue and the first stars appeared over the ridge. Roscoe Vale died in the autumn of 1898 after a small runoff year in the cabin behind the wide arms of the wall. He was 82. His knee had locked permanently by then, and he spent his last months in a chair Marta set near the window so he could watch the wash. Tomas Velarde's mason's line hung beside the door on a nail Roscoe had driven for it years ago, and it stayed there after he was gone because Marta could not bring herself to move it, and Nate Ward would not let her. He was buried on the bench above the gulch near a cottonwood that had no flood scars because it stood above the line where water had ever reached. Marta chose the spot. She said he had earned the right to rest where the river could not touch him. Within a few seasons, Roscoe Vale's wall changed how Clearwater Gulch thought about water. Not every family built a V-shaped wall. That was the point. Some moved cabins higher, some cut spill paths, some raised floors on stone piers, some marked old flood scars before they drove the first sill log. The lesson that spread was not build Roscoe's wall. The lesson was, do not ask the river where it is during drought. Ask where it has been when angry. Roscoe lived the rest of his life behind the wide arms of the wall, though he never again called the place safe. He and Marta kept a spring habit. Every thaw, they walked the wash, reset loose stones, cleared brush from the overflow paths, and marked any new scar the water left behind. Roscoe died in the late 1890s after a small runoff year, with Tomas Velarde's mason's line still hanging beside his door. Years later, people still remembered the joke. Vale's building a stone boat in a dry river. It had been a good joke because it looked true. A man had spent his planting season building a prow for water that was not there, while other men built cabins where the ground was flat and convenient. Then the mountain sent the river back all at once. The flat cabins met the flood like doors. Roscoe's wall met it like a blade. Mud climbed the stones. Logs struck the point. Water tore both sides of the valley open and left one small cabin sitting in the quiet behind it. The final image, an old coffee cup on the windowsill, ringed with dried silt, untouched, while the valley around it had been rewritten.